You're muted, Tammy.
I want to begin this week um, with a little bit of a celebration because last week and this week there has been a tremendous amount of activity going on across the state by ordinary people just like you, focused on Medicaid and other issues that affect people with disabilities. So yesterday, a whole bunch of people showed up to talk about a bill that was introduced on Tuesday in our state legislature and had a public hearing a little more than 24 hours later. So we found out that the bill was introduced at 4 p.m. and we went, Medicaid eligibility. Wonder what that means. Click. That looks like it has a lot of impact. Maybe we should ask our other advocate friends. Yes, this has impact. Maybe we should send out an email. And we did at 9 in the morning on Wednesday, mostly because this is a bill that is very similar to some of the rhetoric that we've been talking about for a number of weeks. The bill proposes to increase the frequency with which people have to reapply and go through the process of determining whether or not they're eligible for Medicaid twice a year instead of once. It also would make it so that the forms that people have to fill out were not pre-populated with information. It had a requirement that everybody, all 1.2 million people in Medicaid, would have to have their eligibility reevaluated by January of 2026. And I'm forgetting there was one other provision. It's been a blur. But all of those things we looked at and said, this looks like it makes it harder for people who are qualified to be in Medicaid to stay in Medicaid because it sets up a lot of extra administrative process and makes it easier for people to make mistakes. People meaning the folks filling out the forms themselves, or the people who are getting the forms and then having to process and do all of the checks. So very similar to our conversations about work requirements and those proposals at the federal level. This is a different proposal. It kind of does some similar things. And we've talked about over the last few weeks about how one strategy towards saving Medicaid dollars is to make it harder for people to get in and harder for people to stay in. So while this isn't a federal, this is not part of the federal Medicaid cuts, you can see that the same sort of ideas are appearing in a state bill. And I just want to say that the amount of mobilization that happened, people got their email, they said, yep, I know what this means to my life because I know what it means to have my income checked, have my assets reviewed, go through a functional screen, and what it takes to do that every year because I've done it before and I have to do it because I value the Medicaid care that I get when I go through that process. And it's hard and it's something that if I had to do it twice, I know exactly how much time and effort and stress that would cause me. And you guys shared this post, you contacted your state legislators, you just activated. A lot of folks rearranged their plans. They cleared their care plans. They organized rides. They got themselves to the Capitol. I showed up and there were a whole bunch of people. Some were familiar and some people I'd never met before that were all there to talk about that bill. They'd prepared testimony. They were with it. You showed up, you were in person. And I'm going to say that between 9 in the morning and the close of business Wednesday, so many people had called across the state that the author of the bill walked in and said he was working on an amendment to exempt people with developmental disabilities. Let's take that as a small victory of you guys were so effective at raising the flag that this is not an acceptable thing, that the author of the bill went, well, I'm hearing from this population of people, and so I'm going to look like I'm being responsive and put out an amendment. Many of you immediately who were at the hearing said, well, why didn't you have, if you intended to exempt certain people, wasn't it in the original bill? And by the way, we don't believe that your amendment will fully cover what needs to be covered. So, I think that was a perfect way to handle that kind of amendment. But the reality is that they heard so much from people like you that they knew that they had to make some sign that they had heard you and that they were trying to be responsive. And I think that at the hearing, there was definitely a lot of information that was shared that was totally new to those lawmakers. It was very clear. Sometimes lawmakers, and we hear this when we're talking about the federal, talking points that you keep hearing as a constituent. Sometimes there is, lawmakers can create their own myths and then they believe those myths. And a lot of you showed up in person to talk about what reality actually is in a very real way that challenged what lawmakers thought they had deeply held beliefs about who was in Medicaid. And it was very clear that they knew they had to learn a lot more because they realized that they were designing a bill here that was really not reflecting what people's lived experience was. If you haven't had a chance to watch the hearing, it is archived on Wisconsin Eye, which is our version of C-SPAN sort of in the state. You have to sign up for an account, but it's free and you've given your email address to everybody anyway. So if you want to take some time and watch, a couple hours of testimony or hear it as you're doing the dishes or something, I think it's really worth it because it's such a great, this is the model. The stories that people told, the testimony that was given by every single person who attended that hearing is absolutely the exact kind of thing that you want to say and that lawmakers need to hear. So if you've never testified before, or you're thinking about attending the state budget hearings, or you're going to an in-district meeting and you've never done that before, take a listen to some of the people from around the state who came to this hearing and talked about their lives and their reality. They all did a great job. The information was deeply personal, very powerful, very true. Lots of people drew on their experience from their careers. They drew on their experience as an unpaid family caregiver. They talked about, the value of the benefits they got. They said they were taxpayers who had paid into the Medicaid system. It was really, everybody who attended did a great job. So you can listen to a whole bunch of different people and see these as examples of how you can say things about your own life as the occasion arises. I think the other thing that's important here is that this is the kind of rapid response that we should expect we will have to do again, and probably in the near future. And this time it may not be at the state level, but it may be at the federal level. This hearing went so well. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and this is the best hearing that I've seen in 15 years. And it looked like we had done a lot of planning and organizing and it was well coordinated. None of that was true. We just had people who said, I know what to do, and they did it. You couldn't have designed a better hearing that really talked about all the reasons why adding more paperwork was going to be a real problem for people. We had folks show up that said, you know what? I can't write. My hands don't work like other people's hands. If this happens, pre-populated forms are a big deal to me. We had people talk about how their family caregivers had to help them with the forms because it was too complex and their disability just wouldn't allow them to complete this themselves. We had lawmakers ask questions about how do we make the process simpler. All of that stuff is because of your real experience, and it's all because we have a group of people in this state who knows what to do, and they do it. So you make us look great because it looks like we're magicians who have magically coordinated a perfect hearing, and we didn't do any of the coordinating. We just have great people who show up and are willing to do the things. So keep that in mind. Put it on your playlist for this week when you need a pick-me-up. And now we're going to talk about why we think that this is going to have to be something that happens again in the near future. I also want to give some other shout outs. We're going to spend some time celebrating today because I feel like we need that on a Friday. Lots of you have also been having success at getting letters to the editor published. So again, if that has been on your to-do list and it hasn't happened quite yet, there's some great examples across the state of people with disabilities and others who are getting their letters published in local papers. All of that is great because people sometimes read the papers, and it also gives you something to share on your social media and with your friends and your larger network of people who may still not understand what these cuts might mean at a federal level. Again, lots of opinion pieces appearing about disability issues and Medicaid specifically. And the last thing before we dig into what's happening in Congress is I want to reflect that last week we had 2 out of our 4 state budget hearings happen. And the first one was in Kaukauna on Tuesday, and then on Friday, the second hearing happened in West Allis. And lots of people with disabilities and family members participated in those hearings. Some of the most powerful testimony, I was getting texts that people were in tears with some of the stories. It's like, yes, make them cry. That's your sign of success. But you guys need to know what the state Joint Finance Committee heard. The top 2 things they heard about were Medicaid and special education. And those are 2 issues that people like yourselves are really, really interested and engaged in. So you guys showed up at those hearings, and the press coverage, I have 2 articles here that are more on the education side, but the press coverage about those hearings was about what people said, which was Medicaid and special education. So again, all of your work collaboratively to show up and say the things. Some people probably had to rearrange their day. They spent all day there. They had 2 or 3 minutes to speak. It mattered because repetition matters. The number of people talking about the same thing matters. The coverage you get after the event matters. And there's 2 more hearings that are coming up at the end of the month on the 28th and 29th in Hayward and Wausau. So there's more opportunities for different people in different parts of the state to also show up and talk about some of the same things and get the same kind of coverage. All right. So what's Congress been up to? It's been a very busy week, and we're going to do some updates on the reconciliation bill process first. And then we're going to start, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the developments that are happening on the executive branch side, the federal agency side. I'm going to preface this by saying I finished this presentation at about 9 o'clock last night. And on Friday mornings, there's often a flood of new news and new announcements of things that are happening. Friday is often a day, it's called a press dump day. And a lot of times things will be announced on Friday because they hope that people aren't paying attention and they're going into the weekend, and that is often true. So that is a strategy to announce things on a Friday. In fact, the bill that advocates that you testified on at the state legislature, they introduced it for co-sponsorship on a Friday. had the co-sponsorship close on a Monday, introduce the bill at 4 p.m. on Tuesday to have a hearing on Thursday. That is a strategy, right? That is the strategy we've been talking about get all of everything done behind the scenes and then kind of spring it and move it fast before people can have a chance to know what's in it or have any ability to respond. So I'm putting that in your mind as we saw that as an example at the state level this week. And I've been saying that I think once reconciliation starts, we're going to see a lot of behind closed doors stuff. And then at the end, the great reveal about what those cuts are and have very little time to respond. So it's a good thing that we had some practice this week on how to do that, because I think that will be really helpful as the weeks go on. So this week, last Saturday, the Senate passed its budget resolution on 4/6. And there was a lot of back and forth this week about whether or not the House would agree to what the Senate did, because the Senate resolution looks a little bit different. Lots of like gnashing of teeth and tugging at ropes and stuff. I'll spare you the drama, because all of the advocates who were kind of like watching ping pong going back and forth, and you were like, got your hopes up that maybe they wouldn't pass it and we'd have a delay, and then everybody fell in line. So the House passed what the Senate passed yesterday, 4-10. That unlocks the reconciliation process. So this holding pattern that we've been having, remember, we were supposed to be done with this part by the late February, and we're in the middle of April. So look at how much time you bought us, right? So now we're in the place where the reconciliation process can begin, which means that the real decisions about what cuts and how deep are starting to happen now. Okay. Also, Congress, except for the committees who are considering what cuts to do, Congress is supposed to be back in district the next 2 weeks. So this is an important period of time for us to do all the things that we did the last time they were in district. Again, like we've had practice at this now. We know how to drop into in-district offices and have chats with staffers. Some of the groups that are working within the congressional districts are trying to organize like community conversation, invitation only events to help educate lawmakers. There are lots of approaches that are being kind of thought about for how do we use this 2-week period when members are home to the best of their advantage. I think Senator Baldwin is coming back in, and there's definitely been some interest in her on her part to do more roundtables specifically about Medicaid, which again, that's great because it gets a lot of coverage. And last time she did that, most of the people around her were people with disabilities. So it was a great way to showcase what Medicaid does for those folks. So a lot of thinking and work about how do we use this next 2 weeks, because after that, I think things could start moving much, much faster. So what's in the Senate resolution? How is it different? And what does that mean? In some ways, I'll bury my lead a little bit. The differences don't mean that much because the intent and the scale of the cuts is largely the same. So the approach is different. And we've talked about this last week. The Senate budget resolution is strategic in the way that it does not, it sets really low amounts that the individual committees must cut, with the understanding that they're going to go higher, right? I think there's, that's a strategy in the sense that the House was real clear. Like, we're cutting $880 billion from the committee that oversees Medicaid, and there's really no way that you don't make deep cuts to Medicaid with that number, right? They've been very clear about intent. This approach kind of buries that intent, and it doesn't provide high numbers in certain places that really give you a clear indication of what cuts they want to do. I think the important part is that the low minimums that are set for each committee to cut don't mean less cuts. There's no limit to how much the committee to cut. The minimum is the floor. There is no ceiling. So while it may look more comforting, it really isn't. It's built to hide. There were a couple of interesting things included in the Senate resolution. I think the important piece is the Senate resolution keeps the House's language that requires the House committee that oversees Medicaid to cut $880 billion. That was definitely something the fiscal conservatives in the House wanted. And what it means is the instructions are the same. So that, the Senate may have given its committees lower numbers, lower floors, but they didn't change the instructions that the House have already given to its committees. So essentially, we're in the same place. There were a couple of amendments, one failed, that would have taken out that language that the House has had in specifically about Medicaid. And it's important to know that that failed. The Senate had an option to say, maybe we would like to not specifically remove the instructions to the House committee that guarantees big Medicaid cuts. Maybe we could do that. And they said, no, we're going to leave it the same. Okay. There was an amendment that was added to strengthen and improve Medicaid for the most vulnerable populations. And I think that the hearing that we saw in the state level is a good illustration of, this is language that is intended to be comforting. And there's some sort of vague understanding of who vulnerable populations might be, but there's no definition. So who is vulnerable? That's a very subjective word, right? Vulnerable could mean a lot of things. And some of us would have that be a pretty big group of people, but it could also be a very small group of people. Vulnerable is subjective. People with certain kinds of disabilities, older adults between 60 and 65, people who are blind, or those are more specific categories where at least you can get a sense of who is supposed to be in the category of vulnerable. This amendment doesn't have that. So it's a gesture. It is a messaging gesture. It's designed to be comforting, but as one senator said, the word vulnerable without any definition around it is, in his interpretation, code for cutting benefits, right? Because it means that it's okay to cut things that, first of all, that don't impact vulnerable people. And since we don't define who vulnerable people are, it may mean you're cutting things that are important to those groups as well. And the reason why I'm kind of drawing your attention back to the state hearing we had, that idea of an amendment to cover people with developmental disabilities is an example of this kind of approach where, we're recognizing there are certain people that we don't want to have, don't want to impact. And so we want to recognize that in the statute. But as people at the hearing pointed out, just exempt, creating some pathway except for people with developmental disabilities doesn't really help you, because first of all, you have to prove now that you're a person who meets that exemption. So there's some sort of bureaucratic process for that. And secondly, there are a lot of people who have the same challenges as people with developmental disabilities who aren't included in that statutory category. There's actually a statutory definition of what developmental disability is. And there are a lot of people with disabilities who fall outside of that definition, but have some of the same challenges. A lot of older adults have some of the same challenges as people with developmental disabilities, and none of those people get that exemption, right? So some examples are like people who are low vision or who are blind. that isn't included in developmental disability. People who are older adults who have cognitive delay or cognitive challenges, maybe because of ongoing conditions, Alzheimer's being one, dementia being another, but those are not the only two diseases which may cause the same symptoms that many people with developmental disabilities experience. Those people aren't part of that definition of developmental disability. And we have talked about a lot in the past on how big Medicaid cuts, there's really no way you can target harm to some people and protect other people. I think this is a great illustration of why that is. So you can see some generosity, you can see some intent and recognition, but when you think about practice and how do you actually do it, it doesn't feel like you're very protected at all. So the House had all sorts of heartburn about the Senate not passing the House's version of the budget resolution. They got over it and they got it done. You should know that the House fiscal conservatives really don't like the strategy that the Senate is doing with lower minimum cut floors for the committees. They are extremely worried that the final product at the end won't cut deep enough. And to their credit, many of the House fiscal conservatives are very worried about deficit spending. They do not like that the Senate is trying to say that that extending the tax cuts that exist is a cost-nothing endeavor. They do want to recognize that choosing to not collect $4.5 trillion in revenue is a budgetary decision, right? So there is some real logic here. If you are very concerned about the government spending more revenue, more money than the revenue it's taking in, that's deficit spending, they want to make sure that everything you're deciding not to collect, everything that you're deciding to cut is being calculated so that you know whether you're adding more or actually reducing the amount of deficit spending. They got so mad that Speaker Johnson said, look, if you don't like the final product, if we don't follow through on the cuts that you want, you can get rid of me as your leader, which is a pretty dramatic statement. And that, I think, should send a signal to us that there's some real seriousness about following through on cuts. Like, I think there's been some back and forth and some hopefulness about, well, they won't really do that, or, maybe we'll wait and see what happens. Everything that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, nobody has agreed with our point of view, which is no cuts. And certainly there have been things administratively that have been happening that are real cuts to federal agencies and programs and staffing and other things. So there certainly seems to be a lot of activity that is really indicating it isn't a matter of whether we have members who are wanting the status quo to just go on. It's a matter of we have members who are trying to decide what it is they want to cut and how much. This week, an interesting survey came out. There is a new group, the Modern Medicaid, called ORG, and it's really an alliance of hospitals and health insurers, which are oftentimes not on the same side of these issues, and they have very different interests than the people who actually use the programs. But for a while we were kind of trying to figure out, where are the hospitals and the insurance, they have a lot of lobbying power, where are they on Medicaid issues, and they kind of hung back a little bit. Now I think they're starting to see that there's some serious effort to cut Medicaid, and they're getting much more engaged. Which is also a signal that, thank goodness for the work that you guys have been doing since January, because the rest of the professionals are catching up to you now. Okay, so they conducted a survey with the same pollster who President Trump used on his campaign. And they asked people between March 20th and 24th a whole bunch of questions, and many of them about Medicaid. So March 20th feels like several thousand years ago. I guess it's only 3 weeks. So this is survey results from, 3 weeks ago in the past. Maybe some of these numbers have changed since then. But the survey found with a fairly conservative pollster that the majority of people who are voted for President Trump really do like Medicaid. They don't like the idea of cutting Medicaid that much. And you can kind of see on this slide here, you'll have a link to the actual full survey and also the article that covered the main highlights of it. Most people are not super supportive of cutting big programs. You look at long-term services and supports, all of those things, there's about 60% of Trump voters and 68% of people who are more swing voters who say, yeah, I don't think I want to cut that. These are folks that live in towns just like you do, right? All across the country. And I think that there are a group of people that a lot of our Republican leaders are paying attention to, because they are more likely to be voters who may have supported those candidates. So we're at a point where Congress knows people are watching. They have heard very clearly about Medicaid cuts. They're going to keep hearing about it because you're going to keep saying things as one does. And they're very clear that a lot of people are saying, there's a whole bunch of reasons not to cut Medicaid. Obviously, we focus on the people who use the program and all of the value that families get out of having a program that works, whether that's living independently instead of an institution, being able to work and instead of not work, or keep a job or support for unpaid caregivers. All of those things are good. We've talked about how Medicaid supports a lot of small businesses in the state, as well as the entire health and long-term care system. Those things are good. So there's a point where Congress can no longer claim ignorance on some of that stuff. There's just been too many people saying Medicaid is important from so many different angles and perspectives. They do know. The messaging you're going to hear now is going to change slightly, or maybe not, because some of you have been hearing some of the same messaging. And it's very, very much like some of what we heard at this week's state hearing, right? Where there's kind of a myth of, well, there are people in Medicaid who should be working who aren't. Well, 2/3 of people who are working age are already working in Medicaid, right? There's some other myths about fraud, waste, and abuse that exists and it's high, when in fact evidence shows otherwise. But these kind of myths keep getting repeated by lawmakers. And so now they're in a position where they definitely want to make some big cuts. And they definitely have created a budget resolution that's going to require that. And in fact, some of their menu of cuts, it's really clear that they can't just implement work requirements or changes to eligibility requirements. They can't only do a couple of things and end up at the number that they want. They have to do some bigger things. You're going to see messaging change. They're going to start telling you that things that you see as cuts aren't really cuts. Work requirements is a great example of this, right? And it's very similar to the greater scrutiny on eligibility, right? The idea of, creating a more rigorous process to prevent people who shouldn't be getting in to Medicaid from getting in, or preventing people who aren't working from accessing benefits. And really what it is creating a whole bunch of administrative process and burden that in the end ends up tripping up people who are eligible for Medicaid and keeping them out. You do save money that way. You do save money when people who should be getting care aren't getting it through you save Medicaid dollars. It doesn't mean those people don't need care, and it doesn't mean they aren't ending up in an emergency room or going medically bankrupt or some other thing happens to them. But it means Medicaid isn't paying those bills, right? So there's going to be an effort to try and convince you that some of the things that will result in people not getting in or staying in a program, or that people who are eligible now won't be eligible in the future, they're going to try and say that those things aren't actually cuts. I would argue they are. I would argue that if the same group of people who's eligible today and getting benefits today changes, that those people who were getting benefits and now are not, that is a cut to the program. Those people are no longer there. They're also going to try and, option two, convince people that cuts won't specifically impact them. And many of you have heard some version of this already, right? When somebody tells you, oh, well, we're doing an exemption for people with developmental disabilities, or we don't want to hurt people with disabilities. We aren't targeting you, or this won't impact you. These are promises that Congress cannot make because they cannot keep them. First of all, people with disabilities and older adults make up 25% of the Medicaid population, but they make up 50% of the costs. So if you hand states a huge budget hole in problem, states are the ones that have to make the decision about what do we do to fill up that hole. And we've gone through this before. They can either pay a lot more to keep things exactly the same at the expense of all the other things the state needs to do. And there's been some articles out there about why that won't happen, because the holes are just too big. Or they have to make decisions about who can or can't get into Medicaid, or they have to decide what services they do or don't provide, or they have to decide to pay the people who do the health or long-term work less. Those are really their three levers. Or they can make you wait. You can be eligible and you can be on a wait list. Lots of states do that. So when members of Congress say, well, this won't impact you, first of all, we're the high cost population that needs the most consistent care over time. And very small changes can directly impact people's lives in a very significant way. So that's a big promise to say that everything stays the same for you when we are aiming to remove a bunch of money out of the system. And the second piece is Congress is handing the problem to states. So there's no way that Congress can promise things won't happen to certain people, because each state has to figure it out. And what we do know is that the people who are the highest cost and the fewest number in the Medicaid program are older adults and people with disabilities, which makes sense that you would look to change things, like you're going to get more savings by changing more things for the higher cost population than you would by, doing a bunch, removing a whole bunch of people that don't cost very much. The other strategy is to hide the cuts, right? And some of our friends in Georgetown in December were very, very worried about this third thing, where there could be some tweaks to federal law or even administrative changes with the Centers for Medicaid Services that could dramatically impact who states have to cover and who they don't have to cover, or change the rules so that a lot less Medicaid dollars flow to states. In fact, there was just something that I saw this morning that CMS is doing, which is basically changing what states are allowed to pay for under certain kinds of Medicaid waivers. We'll cover it next week. I don't have the brain capacity right now. But it's an example of, those are some of the ways that you can reduce the amount of money states have to spend on Medicaid dollars, and you don't see it right away, and you don't see it in the legislation, okay? So the good news is, of all the cuts that are being considered, Medicaid is the one that is giving Republicans the most heartburn. And there is definitely a wide variety of opinion. There are definitely, especially in the Senate side, Republicans who are very concerned about the impact of Medicaid cuts to their state. There have been some that have said, I won't vote for a final reconciliation bill that has Medicaid cuts in it. Now, put a pin in that, because we just had a long conversation of, if you can convince people that the things in the bill aren't cuts, won't apply to them, or you can hide the cuts and give the administration permission to do things that may reduce Medicaid spending, you could conceivably get to the point where somebody would vote for the bill and be able to say, well, we didn't cut Medicaid. So I'm just highlighting that for you. Everything that we've been talking about is the same, in the sense that this resolution still means the target is on Medicaid. And there are definitely, now some indications that all of the cut ideas we've talked about in the last several months may still be on the table. Congress really wants to start making these decisions behind the scenes, but they'll have to show their work at some point. They will have to have a piece of legislation that lays out what it is that they're doing, and they're going to have to show their work. And I think we should expect that that might happen in the next 3 to 4 weeks, okay? Another wrinkle that has been reported on this week, there are definitely some states that are now more worried about certain Medicaid cut ideas than they were before. One Medicaid cut idea is to reduce the amount of federal matching funds that go to support care for people in the Medicaid expansion population, which are people between 100 and 138% of the federal poverty line. And Wisconsin is not an expansion state. So this particular idea doesn't directly impact Wisconsin. It's the only one of the 6 or 7 ideas that doesn't directly impact Wisconsin, but it does impact almost every other state. And there's been a lot of talk about, well, if you reduce the amount of federal support for this population, states will drop out, will stop covering the Medicaid expansion population. And I think there's about 9 states that are required to either totally stop or revisit through their legislative process, whether to cover that population or not if the federal match goes down. But there are 3 states highlighted in dark red on this map that expanded Medicaid a different way, and they amended their constitution to do it. And that would mean that the idea that would reduce the amount of federal support coming in for that Medicaid expansion, those 3 states would have to keep covering that population until their constitution was revised to remove that permission. So some of the senators who are really opposed to Medicaid cuts happen to come from those states, because I think they realize that that particular change means a lot more to their particular state budgets, and that the constitutional amendment process takes time. And you have to have voters agree to it. So it is a new wrinkle here. Now, whether or not this increases the pressure to do some of the other ideas, I will tell you that one of my colleagues reported to me in one of our state legislative offices that one of the staffers was talking about block grants and per capita caps, and actually making it come out, making a case that, well, there are so many people who shouldn't be on Medicaid who are, that if we just get rid of those 4 million people, I don't know where 4 million comes from, that that we'd have all this extra money and Wisconsin would come out ahead in a block grant or per capita cap. None of that is true. None of that is true. But that was what was being said. So I think that there's a lot of discussion about some of these ideas that we thought or were publicly promised to be off the table probably aren't off the table. And there could be a lot of like struggle about how to do multiple ideas in a way that maybe makes the impact less on certain states, like these three who may need some time to get their constitutions revised, or makes it so that maybe some of the ideas that we thought were more likely now with this new information, maybe those are less likely and other bigger ideas that impact all states are more likely. Just a few more things for you to share. Wisconsin Health News. This is one of our former Medicaid directors in the state of Wisconsin. He was a Medicaid director under Governor Walker's administration. You know, I think that some lawmakers have kind of been responding to constituents that they don't think federal Medicaid cuts are going to happen, or we'll wait and see, or we have no control over those things. Well, here's a pretty smart guy who used to run Wisconsin's Medicaid program in a Republican administration who's saying, yeah, publicly, yeah, I think we need to prepare that this might happen, that the federal government may really be serious this time about Medicaid cuts. And he did mention several ideas that we've talked about before. Again, confirm Medicaid eligibility. That's entirely what the bill that all those folks testified on and that all of you sent letters to your lawmakers on this week, that's what that's about, right? Do we check or recheck more often or make that process more difficult, more prone to mistakes, and do mistakes result in loss of coverage? That's what Medicaid eligibility means. Work requirements, which we've talked before. Changes to provider taxes, we haven't talked about that as much, but those are three ideas that have kept coming up over and over again, sometimes with fraud, waste, and abuse as a tagline, as part of the mix of things. And those are kind of the less costly ideas to do. So it is unlikely you reach 880 billion just by doing those things. A number of articles have come out by a publication called Stateline, which really follows state policy. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, except that I think this is, again, as you're looking for more things to share, and you're looking to reinforce some of the things that you've probably already heard, there are several articles that were coming out this week that are emphasizing things that you have already been saying. And I know that people like yourselves like to be validated that you are right. So I want to make sure that you get all of the articles that validate what you've been saying and your lived experience. It isn't just you saying this, it's a lot of other folks too. This particular article is really focused on, the home and community-based care, which in our state means Family Care Iris and CLTS. Those are the institutional diversion programs that we have. And we've talked before about how those home and community-based services are of really good value for states. And every state has done them because they realize that keeping people out of higher cost institutional settings like nursing homes or DD centers is a huge fiscal value to the state, as well as being something that the people actually want. And delaying entry into those kinds of institutions is extremely cost effective for the state. But all of those services are optional. And this article is drawing a really clear line about, yes, we are really worried about this important set of services that is very cost effective and prevents people from going to restrictive settings being the first thing that states look at on the chopping block, because it is something they can cut. It is optional services. And I think that's just important for us to know, that states that are in a budget crisis may make decisions that they know are not in the long-term best interest of the state, that are counterintuitive, because those are the decisions that they can make, right? Another article from Stateline, again, This article, I think, is useful in the sense that it helps make the point of who's in Medicaid. And the point that people with disabilities or people who are older adults are about 25% of who Medicaid covers, but they make up 50% of the costs. So that means that, again, those populations who are more significant part of the cost may be more deeply affected, you know, in a scenario where there are Medicaid cuts, first because it doesn't take as much to really disrupt their lives. Like it doesn't take a lot less help to you know, really change what somebody can safely do in the community, right? But also because if you're looking to make big budget reductions, you know, you can cut a lot of people who are low cost, or you can cut things, you know, a smaller population of people that are high cost. Oops. And the last article that State Line came out with this week, which I think is broadly just useful for your purposes, is that, again, there are a lot of people in Medicaid. There are 1.2 million people in Wisconsin's Medicaid programs, and a lot of them have no idea that any of this stuff that we've been talking about for weeks could impact them, which is why your work to keep spreading the word and keep talking about it with your grocery store checkout clerk, you know, whomever you run into on the streets, you know, all your social networks. It's why it's so important, because we still have a lot of people who don't know that Forward Health Card equals Medicaid, that Badger Care equals Medicaid, that Katie Beckett equals Medicaid, and just a ton of people who, you know, are living their lives, think of things are going along in the same way, and it could all change very quickly. And they should be, you know, they should be welcomed in and invited in to add their voices to influence how this goes. Last thing about reconciliation, we spent a lot of time on Medicaid because it's super important. Last week, we talked about all of the other things that the federal government does that are important to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and older adults and families. I've listed all of them here. These are all things that we should also expect may have cuts in the reconciliation bill. Medicaid is the place that most of the cuts seem to be aimed. Some of these are smaller budgetary items, but still the proportion of cuts is fairly high. And there's been some real concern over SNAP, which is food share in Wisconsin. You know, the amount of cuts given to the committee that oversees SNAP is pretty high, which again probably means that that program is you know, going to be one of the things that receives cuts. We've seen a lot of changes at special education, you know, in the Department of Education. There's certainly been proposals to completely eliminate the department. There have been a lot of staff at that department that have fired. Well, a reconciliation bill is one way where you could say all of those staff reductions that have already happened, we'll say that we'll put that in there and reduce the budget so that there isn't money for those staff. That's certainly something that I think we should be watching for in a reconciliation program. And a lot of other things that the federal government provides some portion of money to states to do that could be impacted, that may have downstream effects for states. So now we're moving. We've passed, the House and the Senate have agreed on a budget resolution. The standing committees, like all of those committees that were assigned cuts, now begin their work to write legislation and to make cuts. And the information I got this morning at 6 in the morning is that we should be expecting that the House budget committees, including the committee that is working on what cuts to do to Medicaid, is going to be using their 2-week break to do some of that work. So while Congress is at home in district, some members of Congress are doing this piece, which is they're beginning to decide behind the scenes what cuts are we making and how are we structuring legislative language to do those cuts, okay? So the next 2 weeks aren't really a break for us. But we won't know what the decisions are that they're making, and that's why it's really important to engage with Congress when they're in district and to keep engaging with members through this 2-week period. After that legislation has been drafted, we will end up seeing the work. They will have to release that legislation, and all of the nerds, maybe some of you will be welcomed into the nerd fold, will sit there and they will read a bill and they will try and figure out what it means and trying to analyze, okay, how do we put this in plain language so people know what it says, what cuts are actually being proposed and how will it impact states. We think that once they start releasing the legislation, they could move fairly quickly. So just like what we saw in the state legislature this week, where they, introduced something, 1 week and we're trying to pass it the next week, definitely there is an incentive to move fast here. And we may need to be prepared to act. I don't want you to think that cuts are a guarantee. They're not. It's just that I think the process now is moving, which means we're no longer in this nice delay where we have, all the time in the world to educate and keep sharing and keep calling. Now our work that we've been doing, we've built a foundation that we're going to push off of and keep doing more. Okay. The House and the Senate have to agree to the exact same thing. That is often a struggle for them, right? So just because the reconciliation process is started doesn't mean that it won't have delays and that those delays aren't really important. Every delay that we have is more time to create doubt and more time for us to either stop cuts or change them or make them into something that's different. And I don't want you to negotiate like this is a foregone conclusion. We're still going with no cuts is the best option because it truly is. That is the most predictable thing, is to keep things going as they are. If we want to have substantive conversations about how would we see Medicaid to be different, we could do that. I think we could come up with like half a dozen ideas right now of things that would be useful, but that's not what's happening here. So the name of the game is still delay, cause doubt, stop cuts, make sure that the final bill is as painful as possible and that people know what's in it, know what it's going to mean for them, and they don't like it. This is a slide from last week, and it just kind of restates what I verbally said. There's an incentive to move fast. That's a strategy. Moving fast makes it harder for people to know what's in a bill and what it means. But that's okay. We've got a lot of people who are watching this, a lot of eyes that are watching this, a lot of media that's watching this. All the work that you've done up until now will make this process much more visible, much more public, and much harder for Congress to avoid. And that puts us in the best possible positions to really do the work that's needed to stop cuts. All right, we're going to move to the executive branch. I got to tell you, I got like 3 emails this morning of new things that are happening on Friday morning. So we'll cover that next week. But there has been a lot of stuff that's happened this week, and I think some of it is pretty meaningful for people with disabilities. And then some of the announcements on that have happened this Friday, I think also are very impactful to our community. Remember, here's the role of government. The government collects revenue. And last week we covered like all of the sources of revenue. We covered like you could not do the tax cuts and end up with a lot more revenue and not have to make cuts. These are choices, right? What the government does is it collects money from all of the different sources, decides how to spend it, Then you have federal agencies that are supposed to administer Congress's will, and a lot of that federal revenue, a lot of that tax revenue that you and I pay to the government gets reallocated and comes back to our state in the form of services that we use and depend on and like. Medicaid being one of those things, but many other things as well that you're familiar with. So one of the announcements that happened this week is another announcement about staffing reductions at a federal agency, this time to the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS. And you're like, why are you putting this slide in, Tammy? This is just yet another federal workforce reduction, except this one actually has an impact on revenue. So we talked last week about how extending the tax cuts is, how much revenue that prevents the government from collecting. We also talked about how letting the ACA marketplace subsidies expire increases costs for people, right? And how, the calculation of what the tax cut's worth to folks may change if there are services or other costs that go up. This is another way that's kind of sneaky, but it reduces the amount of revenue coming into the government. So the IRS is planning to cut about 25% of its workforce, but they're the main collectors of revenue. And there's agreement amongst economists. I'm not an economist, but I trust that they know what they're doing. That when you have fewer people who are responsible for collecting revenue, or for looking out for people who should be paying who aren't, right? So there's an enforcement mechanism in IRS where, the people who should pay their taxes and haven't paid enough or haven't paid at all, the IRS, goes after them and says, hey, you need to contribute. When you have fewer people to do those things, it means that the government collects less revenue. And with these staffing cuts, the government's own Treasury Department is projecting at least a 10% reduction in the tax revenue because of these cuts. That's about $500 billion in lost revenue. The reason why that's relevant is, Congress is making spending cut decisions now in a reconciliation bill that's based on the revenue it's expecting to collect. If they're collecting less revenue, that means that, you either run the risk of more deficit spending, even if you're making big cuts, or you need to build in, there's less revenue coming in, so maybe we should make deeper cuts. So this is relevant in the current context of the reconciliation bill, but also in future budgets, because if you keep collecting less revenue, then you are always in the same position where you have to decide either to collect more revenue or to do less spending if you're serious about not spending more than you get in. And if you shrink the amount that you get in, that does mean you need to spend less if you're serious about not adding to the deficit. In addition to the tax cuts, which is really the story of the reconciliation bill, and federal agency cuts, and we highlighted IRS specifically, but obviously there are other federal agencies that are losing a lot of workers. Those workers losing jobs, that's their income. They're not paying as much income tax, or spending as much if they're not able to replace that job quickly. There's also been a lot of back and forth on tariffs this week. Very basically, we had in April 2nd, the president implemented kind of across the board high tariffs on every country in the world. And basic tariffs have the effect of increasing the cost to do business. And if it costs businesses, we don't have simple, very few things are totally made within only one country. Lots of businesses and products that are made or other things have to be imported or they cross different borders. Like you think about a car, there may be parts for that, even if it's manufactured here in the United States, it may rely on parts that come from different parts of the world. Bananas, for example, is not something that we grow very much of in this country because we don't have the climate for it. So, you know, you are importing bananas if you like bananas. And when it costs more for people to import the same things or the parts that they need to make the things here, that increase the cost of doing business. And then the business has a choice. Either they have to absorb that higher cost or they have to raise prices and pass some of that extra cost of doing business onto consumers. And most economists think that that is what will happen with tariffs, that as things cost more to make or more to get in, that those costs are not going to be totally absorbed by a business who can't run in a deficit. They have to be able to break even and make a profit to stay in business, and that will lead to increased consumer pricing. There are also some ripple effects on tariffs. Businesses like certainty. They like the certainty of knowing what their costs are going to be out into the future. That helps them plan. It helps them know how much of something they can afford to make. It helps them know whether they can expand their business and add jobs, or maybe whether they should cut back on what they're doing and reduce the number of jobs they're supporting. All of this stuff is a long way of saying higher prices on consumers mean that for people in fixed incomes, which a lot of low-income older adults and people with disabilities are, your prices go up for the same things, but your income does not. And broadly, less income, if you have a situation where businesses kind of pull back, are unable to do the same volume or do not want to bet on the future and expand, that will impact the number of jobs and result in less income. Again, less income to the federal government, which decreases the revenue. There's been a lot of back and forth on tariffs. The high tariffs that were implemented April 2nd, I believe yesterday or Wednesday, a week later, they were reduced to 10% across the board tariffs for every country. So that's still a tariff for everyone. It's just maybe not the same number as it was the week before. And in China, we have now a 125% tariff on all products coming in from China, and China has reciprocated, right? So we do a lot of trade with China. That particularly, we may have backed down from a week ago tariffs, but they're still in place, and they're in place in a high amount for a country that does a lot of importing and exporting. So it's part of the mix of factors that could lead, these are choices that can mean less money coming to the federal government. And again, those factor into, do you cut programs? Do you increase deficits? Do you figure out how to do things differently so more revenue comes in? So we are still tracking a bunch of different federal agencies and a lot of planned reductions to the federal workforce still coming. I've added our friends at the IRS this week, just so you can see, kind of where we are. This is from an article that was updated on April 8th, is when I pulled the information. Some of these places have increased the number of positions that have been confirmed to be cut. Some of them, you can see that there's a lot more that are planned or it's unknown. And it's, again, just a tracker on, okay, these federal agencies do things for states. Money comes into states from these different areas. What does it mean when you do not have the same workers with the same expertise doing the same things? The Department of Health Services, we've been following closely. There's a number of things that are being released this morning that I think are also impactful. And we've kind of had a back and forth. Last week, we talked about that the Senate committee that oversees the Department of Health and Human Services had asked for a hearing. Specifically, they wanted to have a hearing yesterday, April 10th, on all of these different positions that have been cut at the Department of Health and Human Services. And there was a long list of very good questions the senators had about what's your plan to reorganize? Like, what does this impact, states and contracts and all sorts of things? The secretary hasn't responded to that invitation. And now the Senate is going home for their recess. So that hearing has not been scheduled yet. And it hasn't happened, which means those senators still have questions, right? There's also been kind of some conflicting reports that, there have been public statements, oh, we're going to hire some of our people back, and then there's really not any plan to do that being reported. Just 2 days ago, we heard that some people who worked for the Administration for Community Living, which is being, reorganized into different parts of the department, did hire some people back because they realized they didn't have folks with the expertise to do grants to the states. So there's just a lot of chaos here. And there's also more staff that is being projected to be fired in different places. One of the things that I saw this morning is that the whole unit that calculates the federal poverty level, apparently those folks are not with the department anymore. And that's important because there are an awful lot of programs, including Medicaid, including SNAP, including housing vouchers, that really rely on the federal poverty level number as being the entry point, right? Like you have to be below a certain number to qualify for the program. So not having the staff that's been doing that, just really does fall into the question of, okay, what's the plan here? Because that's a baseline metric that impacts an awful lot of federal funding and funding that flows to states, and whether or not people can be eligible or not for a lot of important programs. Some of these funding cuts are impacting the state. This article came out a little while ago. It's actually from a person in our community who has been raising money and supporting the work at UW-Madison for a research project on epilepsy. And, the National Institutes for Health is a major funder for all sorts of research, some of which is related to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this is an example of, a grant that was supposed to come to the state that didn't. And now there is a funding shortfall that may not be able to be overcome. And that may be the end of a research project that was almost at the end. A lot of times there are research projects that take years or decades to do before you get a result. And, the federal government has been a big supporter of those kinds of projects because they're often not profitable for private companies. So things like rare disease research, which benefit many people in our community, and other stuff, those are probably not things that are going to be picked up and worked on by the private sector. The public sector has played a big role in that. And it's just one example of, a cut that happened in a moment of time that has really derailed a ongoing research project that was almost at the end. Similarly, there have been some cuts to other programs that aren't necessarily directly related to people with developmental disabilities, but that may impact some of the small businesses that serve our population or people in Medicaid. And an example of this is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. There were a number of grants that appear to have been canceled or pulled back. Certainly there have been cuts to that particular portion of the department. And a lot of these mental health providers that serve that receive that piece of federal money also are people who work with Medicaid participants and may be reimbursed by Medicaid dollars. And I think the reason I'm putting this slide in here is that for those of you who are part of the small business provider community, you know your funding for your operational, how do you keep your business running? What is your operating budget? And for many of you, it may be different pieces of money. Medicaid may be a really important piece of it, but for some of these small businesses, other parts of federal dollars, including from SAMHSA or other smaller pots of money, may be an important part of their operating budget, where a cut to one may actually be make the difference between that business staying open or not. And I think one of the folks that we were talking with, on Monday, pointed out that there's already a lack of capacity for certain services and a lack of ability for Medicaid participants to access things that they need. And mental health is certainly one of those things. So everything that is a stress on the provider community that causes a closure or causes a reduction in the amount of people that they can serve really does disproportionately impact Medicaid participants, because there are already a lack of places to go. So we didn't have a hearing yesterday on April 10th, but there's still an important role for people to be able to keep the pressure up. Our Senator Tammy Baldwin does serve on the Senate Health Committee. And I think that, we spent a lot of time talking about the Administration for Community Living being one of the entities that was slated for elimination, and movement of the programs that are in it to different parts of the DHHS. I think that the reason ACL was created was actually to consolidate and improve efficiency and recognize that many disability and aging issues shared similar challenges and solutions. So there's been no plan really publicly about how they're going to reorganize. There has been communication that they're not necessarily eliminating at least the statutory agency, entities that ACL served. I think there's a new ask that, all of these programs really should be kept together as a collective unit for all of the efficiencies, all the reasons why the Administration for Community Living was created in the first place. So if you're inspired and you want to think about what are the 5 things I'm doing today, one thing could be to say, hey, it makes sense in any reorganization plan for the Senate to make sure that all of these programs are kind of moved en masse as a unit to wherever they're going. Because what they do is important, and the population they serve are in, would have similar challenges. Oh, the U.S. Department of Education. So just another article to put in your share files, right? Of what does the Department of Education do? I always like to share some media because I think it's helpful as you kind of trickle out different pieces to have new content. There have been some developments since last week. And I think that our Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction is still trying to figure out, and they've been clear, all state public instruction departments are in the same boat of trying to figure out and interpret a letter that they received last week. So the U.S. Department of Education has sent a letter to states asking them to basically say that they're in compliance with the president's executive order that basically says you can't do DEI, whatever that means. And our department is trying to figure out, there was, again, just a release this morning, trying to figure out and interpret legally what it is they're being asked to comply with. Because it's hard for them to tell right now what is the Department of Education asking them to say, and they are worried, states are collectively worried, that if they say they're in compliance without knowing what compliance means, that somehow there could be a consequence that they don't know will happen if the federal government decides they're not in compliance. And specifically, they're worried that federal funding could be withheld if the government doesn't think they're complying with the executive order. So all of the states who've received this letter are really approaching this very cautiously and trying to ask some more questions about what is it that we're being asked to comply with. The other thing that happened this week, there was $65 million in grants that the Department of Education froze in February, and the Supreme Court ruled this week that it was okay to freeze those grants, that it seems like it's clear that that money will not be unfrozen. And, you know, a specific Wisconsin implication is that, you know, part of that $65 million in grants was coming to Wisconsin specifically to train special education teachers who were going to work in Milwaukee. That money is gone because there was a assertion from the U.S. Department of Education that those grants were being used in a way that would teach divisive ideologies. And so that $3.2 million isn't coming to us, and those teachers aren't going to be trained, and that's 36 less special education teachers for Milwaukee. There we are. If you are interested in education and have a lot of questions about what federal money does in schools, we've shared before the kind of fact sheets for every school district and the maps, so you can see how much money is coming in from the U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Department of Agriculture to each school district. But the Department of Education in Wisconsin is having a series of four sessions about how does federal and state dollars actually work to make schools work. A couple of them are virtual. The first one is next Monday, April 14th, and you can see the dates there. So this might be a good opportunity to ask questions about what is happening at the federal level. Sometimes state agencies actually get a lot of value from the questions they hear, because they don't necessarily know what questions people have unless they hear them. So if you're interested in kind of the education space and education world, this might be something that you could attend and do a little public service for our education friends of the state, and just, you know, ask all of your questions about the impact on special education, so that they know what people are concerned about. Social Security. All right. This is another small ray of sunshine. I'm trying to really hold those up for us today. The ray of sunshine is not that they eliminated 7,000 jobs already, okay? That's not the ray of sunshine. And also, it's not positive that there are thousands of more SSA jobs that are planning to be cut, according to reporting. Lots of the jobs that are being removed, we are concerned, may be the customer service oriented jobs and the disability policy jobs that really are important for people who are trying to get a disability determinants or get through the process to be approved for SSI. So that is, you know, an ongoing saga of what kind of positions are we losing and what expertise is being lost, and what does that mean in terms of how easy or hard or long it takes for people to accomplish what they need to accomplish, whether it's making a small change or whether it's getting to the, you know, getting approved to be in SSI at all, or SSDI at all. There's been some reporting that some of the changes that are already happening are having an impact on the technical systems of the Social Security Administration. It looks like they are cutting more jobs. The part of their forthcoming job cuts include a 50% cut to the technology division, which is responsible for how things run on the website. And a lot of people use that website to save themselves a trip into the Social Security office or a phone call. So again, this is another strategy. We should see it for that, there is no cut to the amount of Social Security benefit checks. That has been something the president has said they don't want to do, and that's been something Congress has said they don't want to do. They do not want to mess with the amount of benefit checks. But these kind of actions may have an impact on whether that benefit check is correct and whether it gets to you on time and whether you get into the program smoothly to start receiving those benefit checks. So, another example of where what Congress is saying and the president is saying may be factually true in the sense that they do not want to cut the amount people are getting. On the other hand, some of the actions that are happening on the federal agency side may in fact put the customer service and the benefit check delivery at risk. Something to watch. Here's the ray of sunshine. I promised it to you. Here it is. So a lot of people were very, very concerned about a proposed change that would, it was a policy change within the Social Security Administration that said, hey, some of the things that you can take care of by making a phone call now, we're going to make you come into the Social Security office to do that. The change was originally proposed March 20th and delayed to be implemented on April 14th, which was Monday. There were a lot of people like you who said this is a bad idea. And they called Congress and they kept making calls. And the first sign of half victory was a delay in the implementation. It was supposed to start on March 20th. It got pushed to April 14th. So that was the first sign that lots of people had raised this issue and it had gotten up high on the radar enough that the department changed what it was planning to do. Okay. Now, just yesterday, it's been reported in a kind of independent reporter publication that the policy won't be implemented at all. That is a victory. That is entirely because people said this will make things harder, not easier, and there is no reason to do this. I think it's important to also note that where the Social Security Administration apparently posted this announcement on one social media platform, X, and did not do a public press release announcing the change. So that is an interesting development in terms of how the administration is choosing to communicate, where they're choosing to communicate, and that they're not being necessarily real public about it when they have made a different decision than what they originally intended. But I want you to see it as a victory because, again, just like the hearing that happened yesterday, it was a lot of people acting all at once who said this is not a good thing. Do not do this. And now it's not happening. All right, we're almost done, kids. Just remember that, Congress has relatively small majorities. We're not talking about huge numbers there's a lot of disagreement in Congress along party lines within the parties, and there simply isn't a huge majority. All of these cuts are choices. Choices can change. Everything is on the table. Good things and bad things. Our aim as advocates is to have as many good things, or all good things, let's be greedy, only have the good things on the table, right? The outcome here is not set. It hasn't been set since January. You have helped create the conditions that have made these choices hard and not stable. And that is a sign of success. and it's because you are an influencer. You are the people who are creating conditions where choices can still be good or bad. The path is not set here. And you still have a really important role to play. You are the people who have to keep reminding legislators of what they heard a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, or 6 weeks ago, or 1,000 years ago, which is January. You have to keep beating the drum. You have to keep educating them. And again, that hearing yesterday, there were so many legislators who thought the bill did one thing and had really had their eyes open. Like, there was some educational magical moments happening when people talked about paperwork of all things, right? I mean, can you imagine a hearing that should be more boring than talking about renewal paperwork? And you guys made it exciting and the most important thing ever, because it is important. It is something that deeply impacts people's lives and their time, and has the paperwork is one thing, but the reason people are doing it is on the other side of the paperwork, and you help them see that. So don't forget that educative role. Don't forget that some of the people who are in the positions to make choices don't fully understand the choices they're making or the consequences of what they're making. I think it's really important to understand that a lot of legislators don't understand what Medicaid is, who it serves, what it does, how it impacts the state. I know we've been educating folks about that for months, but it's clear that we have to keep doing it. Because people will slide into the myths that they've created for themselves and forget all the information that doesn't fit that myth. It's also important that they know you're watching and you know what you're seeing. You are not going to be fooled by the rhetoric that you have now heard many times and hasn't changed. You're not going to be fooled by them saying, well, it's not really a cut, when it is. And you may have to do some reminding of them of that. It's like, well, wait a minute, this makes it harder for people to get in the program or stay in the program. So if they're not in the program and you don't spend the money because somebody who is eligible isn't getting care, that is in fact a cut. You're saving spending, but it's not because somebody was doing something illegal. It's because you've made it too hard. You can say those things from a position of authority. And you are going to be watching and seeing what choices these folks are making, and you're going to be remembering what those choices are and making sure other people know what the impact of those choices are. We only have 3 Republicans in the Senate side that need to change their opinion, and all of these things could change. And it's 4 Republicans on the House side. That's not that many people, and everything is different. There's a lot of different, I've put a bunch of things on here. How real they are, who knows, right? We have seen that Republican Party has, when it's come down to it, despite all their differences of opinion, despite all of their uncomfortableness, especially about Medicaid cuts, they have, in the end, buckled down and just gone along with what leadership has said. That has been true up to this point. It doesn't need to be true the next point in time. And it's our job to make it easier and easier for members who have real concerns about what Medicaid and other cuts will do to their community to do that. So some options, you could suggest this to your member if you wanted to, but just remember, it doesn't take very many people. Lots of opportunities. We've kind of talked about this all the way through. 2 weeks, Congress is in district, do all the things that you did last time they were here. Find some more friends, invite some more people, have them do it too. You guys are well-oiled in practice now. You know how to do this. We've got 2 joint finance hearings at the end of the month. Again, A lot of you have done this before. Invite new people to spend the day. It's important to have different faces, different voices doing the same things. Monday and a Tuesday. Make a plan, go with a group, invite people. You can make Medicaid a top issue. Anytime, all the time. Keep posting, keep sharing, keep telling your story, keep writing op-eds, keep working on county resolutions, keep dropping in offices, you know how to be persistent at this point, and this is important to sustain. It's important to keep doing. You have a lot of ideas of how to do that, and we will continue to, develop more. In May, there are some groups that are trying to host community conversations. Again, the idea is to host something that gets enough credibility that it can be covered by the media. We are trying to keep this issue in the forefront and keep talking about it in different ways. All right, I'm going to leave you with this stuff. You've already done a lot of stuff. That's the foundation. You are a seasoned advocate, even if you don't see yourself as that. And, as we've been waiting for other people to do something, you have become the leaders you've been looking for. Lean into it. Lean into it. It's you guys. Everybody else needs to follow, right? And follow their starting to, even if it's slow. So people with disabilities are the ones that senators have been hearing from. In fact, I was in a meeting yesterday where somebody from DC had just met with Senator Johnson's office, and they specifically said, "Oh, we've been hearing from people with disabilities." They didn't mention any other group. That's important because it means there's a whole lot of other people who are affected, who are from other groups that haven't contacted him yet, and they need to do it too. Okay, so you guys have been the leaders. You are the leaders. Lean into it. Show them how it's done. And we're going to have to keep doing that for the next few weeks. This is not over yet. And next week, we'll talk about all the things that have happened in the next 6 days. I'm sure there's going to be a lot. I'm over time, I'm being told, I'm being texted. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And if folks have questions, we'll try and answer them.